Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for all of our participants from all over the world. My name is David Luna, and I am the co-director of the Anti-Illicit Trade Institute with Dr. Louise Shelley, the director of the Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center at George Mason University, and who will shortly provide the keynote on the threats posed by hubs of illicit trade around the world. It is a pleasure to participate in this public launch of the new TRACC project with our team of international recognized research team partners and honored guests who have joined us this morning. It is an equal honor to co-chair this event with Robin Cartwright. As it relates to the launch of this important research, and at this point in time, we are only examining 4 hubs of regional illicit markets. They are the UAE, Dubai, the tri-border area in South America, consisting of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, Central America, with a focus on Guatemala, and Eastern Europe, with a focus initially on Ukraine and neighboring states. It is important to know that while we are in this introductory phase of the project, and we have just started to undertake some of the preliminary research examining these 4 hubs, the interconnections and the ripple effects that they have across other illicit trade hubs, free trade zones, marketplaces, and global supply chains include not only the bad actors and threat networks and their enablers, but other illicit threats that also become important. The hubs of illicit trades have a greater impact across borders, more than many realize, given their strategic role in furthering not only legitimate trade and movement of illicit goods, but increasingly these hubs are fueling the global illegal economy, fueling corruption, money laundering, violence, and other security threats in their localized landscapes and across borders. More globally, these hubs continue to alarm various communities as they collectively become a bigger threat altogether, and as threat multipliers impact an array of harms, be it economic, human, social, political, or environmental. In fact, today across illicit hubs, trillions of dollars of dirty money threaten our prosperity, stability, and the public health and safety of our citizens. This includes a convergence of criminalized markets and the range of illicit activities, from the smuggling and trafficking of narcotics, opioids, weapons, humans, counterfeit and pirated goods, illegal tobacco and alcohol products, illegally harvested timber, wildlife, fish, pillaged oil, and other natural resources and contraband commodities. The United Nations has estimated that such dirty money laundered every year from such criminal activities constitutes 5% of global gross domestic product, or about $4.5 trillion in 2021. As these hubs become a greater increasing security concern, this TRACC research will probe some of the driving factors that fuel these hubs, including key illegal sectors. We will examine who some of the enablers are, and during the current COVID pandemic, explore how such illicit trade has been accelerated across markets and in conflict zones. And finally, our research will also ask the question, what can we do about this as we work through collective actions? These are the critical questions and aims of our project. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Shelley, let me ask my co-chair, Robin, to make some introductory comments as well. Robin is an organized crime researcher and author, network member of the Global Initiative on Transnational Organized Crime, and was a former partner at KPMG's Global Strategies team. Robin.
Thank you, David, and thanks for the introduction and for the wise words. I'm not going to add too much at this stage, other than to say I'm really excited to be part of the project, not least because we are focusing on the intersection of different crimes and how they kind of co-support each other. And this is something that's been of great concern to lawmakers and industry and governments and communities alike, because each time criminals find a way of making really good money out of multiple crimes, you see this huge concentration of criminal activity, which is what we think we're going to find in each of our hotspot hubs, if you like. So I'm very excited to hear from the four hubs as we move forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Robin. Now we will hear from our keynote speaker, Dr. Louise Shelley, who is the Omar and Nancy Hurst Endowed Chair and University Professor at George Mason University. As mentioned, Dr. Shelley is also the founder and director of the Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center, and has written extensively on national security threats, including corruption, human trafficking, transnational crime, and terrorism. In her two books, recent books, Dark Karmas, How a New Illicit Economy is Threatening Our Future, and Dirty Entanglements, Corruption, Crime, and Terrorism, and other publications as well. Dr. Shelley.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for having such a wonderful team to work on this important issue. As a researcher, I'll talk a little bit about why we chose these hubs and what different types of hubs exist. So it's not as if you can point to one particular region and say, oh, we're looking at a port, like we might look at the port of Marseille or New York or Vladivostok and say that's a center of transnational crime. Illicit trade hubs are more complex and that have many characteristics that we know as researchers and more that we hope to identify. And so we hope in this project to use past research and present research with a truly international team to get at an understanding of really global trade, hubs of illicit trade, as well as regional or sub-regional hubs of illicit trade. So there are certain characteristics that we already know that characterize hubs of illicit trade. First of all, these enabling environments have ineffective rules and enforcement. And as you're going to see in the presentations that will be shown to you, they all have high levels of corruption, as shown by the Transparency International indices. And in some cases, the states are captured by the criminals who are involved in this trade, or the corporate leaders who are involved in this illicit trade, or the heads of state are profiting from this illicit trade. There are also areas with traditions of limited rule of law and respect for legality. And many of these regions that we're going to be looking at have a history of conflict that makes regions more likely to have illicit trade. So we are looking at Central America, we're looking at Ukraine and its borders. All of these are areas with histories of conflict, and unfortunately, as we're going to be looking at in Ukraine, is an active conflict, which we had not anticipated when we started out this project, but we were going to go revisit the borders of Ukraine with Western Europe. We also find that many of these areas that are involved in illicit trade have found illicit trade as a competitive market niche in the global economy. They can't be competing actively in the legitimate economy, and so they found that they can profit significantly in the illicit economy. Many of them have excellent transport connections, but this is not necessary. It's not the case in Central America. The tri-border area in Latin America and South America is not necessarily the top transport hub, as is Dubai. So there are different conditions that we need to be looking at. But one of the things that is very important in finding illicit trade hubs is the presence of free trade zones. And there are many free trade zones, thousands of them throughout the world, and they are in many cases facilitators of illicit trade. In other research that we're doing at TRAC, we find large numbers of counterfeits, large amounts of wildlife moving, or illicitly traded wildlife moving through free trade zones. So they're an important part of all of this activity, and they are central to almost all of the trade hubs that we're looking at. And as we'll see, that there is a convergence both of high levels of corruption, often of organized crime in these hubs that we're looking at. And in some cases, some of the participants in these trade hubs also have links to terrorism and terrorist organizations, either laundering money, generating capital for them. So we're looking at a variety of pernicious non-state actors intersecting with governmental officials and high levels of corruption. So you're going to have presentations by each of the specialists, but let me say a few words about why we chose hubs and chose different types of hubs that would be interesting for our research. So in Dubai, as we're going to hear, which is a key transit point for so many types of goods, as you're going to hear, and in NSF-funded research, we keep finding large amounts of counterfeit transiting it. We have a permissive regime, limited rule of law, a proximity to seek consumer goods that are not necessarily concerned with the integrity of these goods, and the presence of free trade zones that are ample facilitators of this illicit trade. In Ukraine, several years ago, we looked at the cross-border trade to the West. But as I've mentioned, we've turned into Ukraine since we imagined this project has been converted into a war zone. And we now also have much smuggling in the eastern part of the country that is the focal point of the attacks at the present time. So this is a very fluid situation, and we're going to try and capture the diversity and the changes in the products that are moving since the advent of war. Central America is an area of great concern to the US because it is the source of much illegal or irregular migration. And this migration is triggered by a non-functioning economy, high levels of corruption, and organized crime that is out of control. So it reveals that these phenomena are much more central to the functioning of the state than many people think about. And illicit trade that is uncontrolled is extremely criminogenic and amplifies the corruption. And the leadership's assault on the judiciary and prosecutors in Guatemala has been an enormous facilitator of illicit trade recently. And as some of you may not know, the ex-president of Honduras was recently extradited to the United States for his role in the drug trade, and his brother has been convicted. So this reveals the very high levels of corruption that facilitate this illicit trade in Central America. And the last area that we're going to talk about, which is the tri-border area in South America, which involves Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay, and we'll be having our team from Brazil reporting on this, is a notorious area known for the connections of crime, terrorism, and corruption. And this is not a regional trade hub, but a global trade hub, because this illicit trade from this region intersects with Africa, the Middle East, as well as Europe. So we'll be looking at the political context in which all of these trade hubs operate and where the products are going, at what level they are being offered to the world, and what they are facilitating on a larger level. David mentioned in the beginning that we're going to be going on to focus on what we learn and what this informs about policy. Being an academic institution and not a think tank, it is important that we don't know what we're going to find. It's part of academic research is that one never knows what comes out of this. And so we can't predict what we're going to find. But I think that some of the issues that we will be focusing on is a better understanding of how to address the illicit trade and the criminality that is facilitated by free trade zones. What regulations are needed? What oversight should there be? How can private companies better monitor illicit supply chains? And we also need to talk much more about public-private partnerships and what the corporate world can be doing. We need to also be thinking as we formulate our policies of approaches to corruption, not as a general problem, but as one linked to illicit trade. We also need to be thinking about illicit trade and how it figures in our strategies to address armed conflict. When we think about the illicit trade that's going on out of Ukraine at the moment in grain, this is just a phenomenal problem for the international community because it is putting money into the hands of the Russians. And yet, how do countries that are starving and depend on this grain reject it? So we have enormous moral and security questions that come out of illicit trade and conflict, let alone the problems that come with millions and millions of refugees and displaced persons and the problems of human trafficking and that arise from this environment. Are there international instruments that we can use to address this illicit trade? And how can technology better help us address these problems? These are just some of the issues that we will be thinking about as we are going forward. So I will conclude my remarks now. Thank our over 150 participants that are on this webinar from literally all over the world, who many of you have insights and research that are key. And we look forward to not just having a webinar in which we talk, but intersecting with our broad, knowledgeable international community to help guide us further in our research. So thank you for being with us on this launch. And thank you to everybody at TRAC and our wonderful researchers who you will be hearing from shortly. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Shelley. And again, thank you for your leadership over the years on these important issues, and educating various communities on really the multi-dimensional harms and impacts of illicit trade, but also the bad actors and threat networks behind the illicit trade across borders and their enablers and facilitators. I think you began to highlight aspects of the project that are becoming increasingly more important, including how many of these hubs are linked to other cross-border threats and the crime convergence as one specific illicit trade area impacts or fuels other criminal activity around the world. So again, thank you for your leadership and working with the TRAC team in this important project. Now we will have our four leads of each of the four hubs provide an overview of the specific research that they will be undertaking. Our first presenter will focus on UAE Dubai. Dr. Yulia Grilova is a research scholar at TRAC. She also works as a consultant for the World Bank, UN, United Nations Women, and other international organizations. Her areas of expertise include corruption, organized crime, and international development. Yulia, please.
Thank you, David. And Here you can see my presentation. Dubai is a global hub for illicit trade, money laundering, and sanctions evasion. The global nature of illicit trades in this hub can be best described by saying that all roads for smuggling routes lead to Dubai. Next, based on the Global Organized Crime Index, Dubai is a hotbed of different types of crimes, including human trafficking, smuggling, arms trafficking, environmental crimes, natural resource crimes, and drug trade. To a large extent, Dubai's illicit trades mirror illicit trades. For example, Dubai is known as the city of gold. Gold is commodity number one traded in Dubai. In 2020, the value of gold traded in the UAE was about $57 billion. 112 countries imported gold to Dubai, depicted on the map. There are no exact figures on illicit gold trade, yet comparing records from the United Nations Comtrade database, we can see a huge gap between the value of gold exported to the UAE and gold imported by the UAE in the amount of $26 billion. Here you can see some other examples. Based on our calculations, at least 26% of gold is coming to Dubai from conflict-affected and fragile countries, such as Mali, Congo, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and Afghanistan. The World Customs Organization ranked the UAE third on the number of seizures involving arms trafficking. The UAE is responsible for about 7% of illicit cigarettes in the global market. The United States Department of State placed the UAE among tier 2 countries due to deficiencies in anti-trafficking regulations and enforcement. And last year, the Dubai police seized almost 2 billion counterfeit items. And now about the enabling environment. Dubai is very attractive for criminals from all over the world. First of all, Dubai has a highly developed transport and logistics infrastructure. Before COVID, Dubai International Airport was ranked 4th on the number of passengers. Jebel Ali is the largest port in the Middle East, ranked 10th in the world. Huge traffic volumes of containers in ports make it very difficult to identify suspicious shipments. Dubai has around 30 free trade zones. Many of them are located close to the ports. Their key vulnerabilities include weak procedures to inspect the goods and a lack of cooperation between zone and customs authorities. Dubai is also one of the global financial centers, yet due to deficiencies in anti-money laundering regulations, the Financial Action Task Force placed Dubai on its gray list for increased monitoring. Also, according to FinCEN Files database with leaked suspicious transaction reports, we can see many Dubai-based banks there. Dubai is also an attractive city for laundering criminal proceeds in real estate. Last year, the Dubai Land Department registered about 85,000 transactions worth $82 billion. The Dubai Property Leaks database provides evidence that at least 27% of Dubai properties belong to foreign agents. According to our calculations, at least 10% of these property owners are from conflict-affected and fragile states, such as Venezuela, Afghanistan, Yemen, and Eritrea. And now about criminal actors. Next slide. In Dubai, you can find all kinds of actors benefiting from illicit trades. Free trade zones are under patronage of the government of Dubai and Sheikh Mohammed. Dubai lacks independent anti-corruption mechanism, and senior officials from the ruling family are protected against public scrutiny. Key beneficiaries of illicit trades also include political elites and affiliated businessmen from many autocracies and sanctioned countries, such as Russia, Belarus, Venezuela, Libya, Syria, and Iran. Other actors include terrorist organizations and armed groups, for example, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, Colombian militant groups. corrupt officials and customs officers, corrupt diplomats, organized crime organizations, and private security companies. For example, the Russian Wagner Group or Project Opus linked to an American businessman, Eric Prince. Also, criminal actors and facilitators include shipping companies, for example, the Iranian shipping lines, and many Dubai-based and international banks. And this was my brief description of this hub. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Krylova. And now next to our next hub, and Casey, thank you for sharing the protocols as to when we get to the question and answers in the chat. Our next hub is the Tri-Border area, and this is being led by Dr. Jorge Lasmar, who is Professor of International Relations at PUC Minas, Brazil, and the co-director of the Collaborative Research Network on Terrorism, Radicalization, and Organized Crime, as well as Dr. Rashmi Singh, who's Professor of International Relations at PUC Minas, Brazil, as well, and the co-founder and co-director of the Research Network on Terrorism, Radicalization, and Transnational Crime. Dr. Singh is also a consultant and expert advising various government and military organizations on terrorism, counterterrorism, political violence, and organized crime. Dr. Singh.
Thank you, David. Greetings from Brazil. As you can see my slides up there, the tri-border area is commonly referred to as the triple frontier and is the border region encompassing areas from 3 countries of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. The region is actually one of many Brazilian tri-borders and a hub that connects the economies of the La Plata Basin countries to markets both licit and illicit, such as China, Europe, and the United States. Next slide, please. The region is often cited for its links with a wide range of activities related to money laundering. We see considerable smuggling, embezzlement, drug trafficking, a flourishing trade in weapons. All of these are transferred through different artifices and frauds linked to international trade. These criminal activities encompass interlinked undertakings that generate a vast stream of interconnected illicit financial flows. Activities here range from legal business practices, illicit tax and commercial practices, to an ample illegal market in counterfeits, smuggled goods, drugs, and weapons. A highly evolved and entrenched network of corruption facilitates these activities. There is evidence of the presence of terrorist financing, including financing and money laundering activities linked to the virulent transnational group Hezbollah. Next slide, please. Although the Global Organized Crime Index considers Argentina a low-crime, highly resilient country, unfortunately, both Paraguay and Brazil rank well above the global average in almost all of the crimes analyzed in the index. In the range of crimes addressed in the study, weapons and drug trafficking are highly prominent, and there are a few highlights worth mentioning. 57% of the Brazilian cigarette market originates from smuggling, mainly from Paraguay, and has been considered by the Brazilian Financial Intelligence Unit, COAFI, as the most vulnerable sector to be linked to the financing of terrorism. Drug trafficking is the second most reported crime in Brazil and stands as the 4th most illicit reported. Drug trafficking moved just over $4 million from 2015 to 2019. Counterfeits and smuggling is another source of concern. The market here is worth an estimated $210 billion in Latin America, which is equivalent to about 2% of the GNP of all Latin American countries. There has been a significant increase in the number of suspicious transaction reports linked to arms trafficking as well. Paraguay ranks 8th and Brazil 14th out of 193 countries in the Global Organized Crime Index's ranking for arms trafficking. Financial resources from trafficking are sent abroad for the purchase of weapons and other narcotics not produced in Brazil, or in some cases, the region more widely. In other words, there is a very high convergence between trades, especially drugs and weapons. Next slide, please. According to the Global Crime Index, state-embedded actors figure prominently in all 3 countries, suggesting a very high degree of corruption. Although mafia-style and criminal actors are significant actors in this tri-border area, the region is also characterized by a strong presence of the main Brazilian criminal network, the First Capital Command, or the PCC, as well as to a lesser degree foreign actors like Hezbollah, as well as the Chinese mafia. Next slide, please. The First Capital Command is a criminal faction that has been operating in a highly organized fashion in the state of Sao Paulo for more than 2 decades. It is the largest criminal organization in the country with more than 70,000 affiliated members. It runs operations across Brazil and the region more generally, but more recently, it has been involved in expanding its repertoire to include transnational operations. It is present in at least 7 countries in Latin America, including Argentina and Paraguay. And it is estimated that PCC moves around $200 million a year. In addition to being a powerful and highly organized criminal group, the PCC operates in a networked fashion, and its network includes brokers, legal and financial advisors, professional money laundering service providers, facilitators, document fraudsters, and so on. Next slide, please. Various factors contribute as enablers and drivers of the illicit flows in this region. The region represents the geographical intersection of 2 major rivers, namely Rio Paraná and Rio Iguaçu. Border inspection, vigilance, and control is difficult because of the porosity of the borders, which aggravates the region's vulnerability in relation to cross-border crimes. Paraguay is also a free trade zone, making it both attractive as a supplier and a destination. The volume of people, goods, and services that circulate routinely in this region is very high. The TBA demands the most attention from the authorities in Brazil in terms of money laundering and the financing of terrorism. The corruption and flawed governance of the region, combined with the high degree of informality of the local economy, given that it is a highly cash-intensive economy, along with other market vulnerabilities, all contribute as enablers and drivers of crime in this region. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashmi. And onwards to our next hub focused on Central America and Guatemala. Our presenter and lead for this hub is Eugenio Fernandez, who is an international tax business consultant with extensive business experience in Central America, including on countering corruption, illicit trade, and issues related to customs facilitation, customs law. Eugenio.
Eugenio, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. We want to cover a little bit about the area is like Dr. Shelley explained the history of conflict. Usually it's a reason of why this hub crimes exist. In Guatemala, the history of contraband is linked to former armed intelligence apparatus in the Civil War that ended in 1995. They controlled the contraband and illicit trade in Guatemala before the peace agreements. Armed intelligence held the ports and customs for security reasons. After the peace agreement, they kept control over the ports and customs as a spoil of war. They are now promoting illicit trade globally. Can we see the next slide, please? Organized crimes and local gangs in Guatemala have been trying since long time ago to control the government. Many illicit trade hubs are usually controlled by transnational crime and use illegitimate business to hide their illegal operations. Central America is relating to corruption. The infiltration of TOC in state institutions and weak governance by design, it's really destroying the institutions of government. TOC penetration in the states is deepening, leading to the co-option of all institutions. The real nexus among TOC and the three branches of government, including intelligence services and high-level business figures, represent a significant threat to the economic growth and democratic institutions. In Central America, there is a growing evidence of relationship with TOC and adversary states of the United States, like the Russian Federation and China. What we need to understand is that TOC are very like-minded people, profit-driven, so they take supply and demand as drivers and risk factors always take into account. They're getting very sophisticated. They can do it with impunity, no consequences, by controlling weak governments and institutions. They control the contrabands and the ports, and the Guatemalan government lost around 25% of the total tax revenue due to this factor. This enabled that 90% of all cocaine that arrives to the United States goes through Guatemala. Illicit trade, human trafficking, and weapons are also part of what this is growing threats. To keep control of the ports, they need to co-opt all law enforcement, judicial systems, and eventually the entire government. In 2015, Otto Perez Molina, General Otto Perez Molina, lost the presidency and was arrested. But people forget that the reason why he was arrested was because he was found to be the leader of contraband mafia in the ports. So that's how big this is. Also, one of the growing illicit trades that we've been finding in Guatemala, it's cigarettes. 31% has been growing there, and around 3 billion, not only 3 billion are lost in tax revenue, but the 90% of cocaine that goes through Guatemala also generates like $3 billion. Do we have yeah. The systematic political and administrative corruption, criminal organizations have controlled many government agencies. Corruption, law enforcement, and judiciary are high. In the last 2 years, we have at least 25 people working in the judicial system, from the attorney general to the attorney that investigates corruption, that have fled Guatemala coming to the United States. So the attack on the institutions that fight corruption, it's right there. Also, there's a clear movement to attack the free press, and that it's to cop the state and all of that. So Guatemala case show rapidly criminal actors adapt to the business of opportunities. That's always the case. Could we see the next? The organized crime smugglers are trafficked from Mexico and Colombia, and their trafficking is clear. The United States made a study that most Colombia drugs goes to the Pacific and arrives to the Guatemalan ports, and then go to Mexico to here to the United States. International gangs, the M13 and M28, are really becoming international in the local, and United States are connected, and they usually are in charge of human smuggler. Illegal and clandestine security apparatus from the state, illegal and paramilitary services are clearly involved in this. The last time that cigarettes were caught in Guatemala, they were custody by police officers. So we have right now not only corrupt government officials, corrupt customs officials, corrupt port authorities, but the entire branches of government controlled by corruption. And this is a very problematic for security reasons for the United States and Guatemala. Next slide, please. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much, Eugenio, for, again, a preliminary snapshot, not only focused on Guatemala, but as we discussed at the opening, the cross-border dimensions and the impact of illicit trade in Central America, looking as well at free trade zones in Panama and Belize, and looking at, again, the interconnections between not only sub-hubs in Central America, but looking at the Chinese triads, the cartels, and other threat networks like Hezbollah, who are, again, very global in scope across these hubs. So from a diversity of hubs in the Gulf to the Americas, South and Central, as we just heard, we move on now to Eastern Europe. And the leads for our Eastern Europe hub is Dr. Olena Shosko, who is professor of criminology, a Fulbright academic exchange program fellow, as well, who has had 30 years of teaching and research experience at the Yaroslav Madry National Law University in Kharkiv, Ukraine. She will be joined on this hub by Judy Dean, who is the deputy director of TRAC and a former U.S. diplomat, specializing in Central Europe and Eurasia, and had numerous assignments in Russia, Mongolia, Poland, and other countries in Europe. With that, I think Judy or Olena.
Good morning. I'm Judy Dean, and I'm really here just to describe a little bit the background to our Eastern European hub research. As Louise mentioned, when we started this project last summer, we were intending to look at Transnistria mainly and at its impact on the criminal networks operating in Ukraine and Belarus. But once the Russian invasion came, we realized that there was more value in taking a more broad look and seeing what we could learn about the impact of conflict on illicit trade hubs and the shifts that they undergo. And of course, unfortunately, it's turned into far more of a conflict than anybody imagined at the beginning. But we were very fortunate that we have Dr. Olena Shosko, who is a longtime collaborator with TRAC. She was, as David mentioned, she's been a professor at Yaroslav Mudry National Law University, and she's an expert on illicit trade and corruption. And so she is on our team, and she's still currently in Ukraine. She's in Uzhhorod, actually, instead of no longer in Kharkiv. But she's going to be doing the in-country research. And of course, it's hard to describe exactly what it's going to look like, but we know that it's an important subject, and we're very happy to have her. So I'm going to turn this over to Olena now.
Thank you for introducing Judy and David. Dear colleagues, Ukraine having borders with several European Union countries and with the Transnistrian region of Moldova has always been a convenient hub for illegal trade. Russia's brutal aggressive war against Ukraine, which started last February, had made the situation with illegal trade even more complicated because give new favorable opportunities to criminals and the occupants for enrichment. Next slide, please. In the pre-war period, the main illicit trade sectors in Ukraine were drug trafficking, counterfeit pharma, illegal cigarettes and alcohol, human trafficking, illegal timber export. You see that Ukraine has 5.6 score in 2021 Global Organized Crime Index. And on the slide, you see that, for example, Ukraine's customs seizures and largest cases in 2021 include 2 tons undeclared clothes, shoes, watches, 1 ton of heroin trafficking to the European Union, and other cases. But it's on the top of iceberg. Next slide, please. War-related change, what we see now. In wartime, we see changes in illicit market structures and production patterns. New sectors include humanitarian assistance, fuel, lubricants, weapons, and ammunition. Production inside Ukraine has plummeted. Prices and demand in neighboring countries has skyrocketed because of refugee flows. Fuel and lubricants market especially strongly affected. I'd like to say that Western borders are more tightly controlled than Eastern borders with Belarus and Russia. So illicit trade patterns are also shifting. In illegal trade, actively involved Russia as a state because it looted grain, agricultural products, metal, and other goods from Ukraine and sent them to Russia or traded them. And next slide, please. Human trafficking is a major concern because the war has led to such a massive displacement of people in Ukraine. More than 14 million people have left their homes since beginning their invasion, according to United Nations data. And we have 3 categories of concern. More than 6.5 million Ukrainians are now refugees in the West. Like my family and me, a larger number of people displaced from their homes remains in Ukraine. It's about 8 million. A major concern remains about civilians and prisoners of war who have been forcibly deported to Russia. Traffickers are the Russian military and civilian authorities. Victims' fates are unclear, but there is evidence that the Crimea and temporarily occupied territories have turned into a human trafficking base. That's all in a brief about Eastern European hub and Ukraine especially. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Alina, and thank you, Judy, as well. It's interesting because across the various illicit hubs, there are new threats that emerge from one day to another. I mean, the pandemic certainly accelerated illicit trade, especially across e-commerce platforms and marketplaces. I saw some of the questions on PPE, and it's great that Dr. Shelley is addressing some of those. But conflicts also have accelerated the illicit trade, whether it's through sanctions in Russia that now organized criminal groups are profiting from, or in the Ukraine, as we heard, not only in the pillaging of grain and metals and natural resources, but the human trafficking dimensions as well. So thank you, Alina, for really underscoring that point. Again, we will be expanding on some of these illicit hubs and their global dimensions and their interconnections. So with that, let me turn it over to my co-chair, Robin, who will lead the discussion here forward. Robin.
Yeah, thank you, David. I thought that was kind of fascinating. I think also, whilst each of those hubs are profoundly different, there's also some key similarities, and a lot of the similarities about connections between crime types and connections between, often a lower sort of level of trust in the governance and a higher level of crime. So sort of an inverse relationship there. I mean, we saw in Dubai both gold being heavily trafficked, but also flora and fauna running through Dubai as a hub. We saw in the tri-border area, it seems to be almost a safe haven for criminals in the illicit tobacco trade, where it's off the chart. Illicit tobacco, Brazil, particularly trafficked through Paraguay, it's believed, but also drug trafficking. So from cigarette to drugs in one easy step, because drug trafficking forms such a high part of the illicit economy there. Then in Central America, it's fascinating to see Guatemala declining in that corruption perceptions index, this sort of decline in the trust of the rule of law, at the same time as the cocaine trade is boosting. Finally, Eastern Europe, extraordinary to hear from our colleagues there. That's a live market in the making, isn't it, really? Both in terms of illicit fuel, and we've heard of grain being looted. And if that isn't a sort of an act of war, I don't know what is, given the prices of commodities that are being driven by the Ukrainian intervention, or special military operation, as Mr. Putin has it. So I just want to encourage some of our friends to help us scope and focus our research in these 4 areas and more generally, because what we're looking for is, why are these particular areas such safe havens? These hubs of illicit trade are such sort of safe places, it seems, for some criminals. I'm not trying to say there's no rule of law, but there's certainly something that's encouraging and enabling that trade to happen. So let me first turn to Channing Mavrelis. Channing's work I've quoted many times in many papers over the years. He's Global Financial Integrity's Illicit Trade Director, and he focuses on the intersection of illicit financial flows, transnational crime, and international trade. Ms. Mavrelis she's over a decade of experience working on these issues, particularly in anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism. She specializes in conducting data-driven analysis, and she's authored numerous reports, including the Transnational Crime and the Developing World Study, which, as I say, I've quoted many times, and for which many thanks. So Channing, if you wouldn't mind giving us a few words.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to the Anti-Illicit Trade Institute and TRAC for having me today, just to provide a couple of thoughts about these excellent presentations. And to that, I want to applaud my peers for the excellent research they have done. Their presentations were very insightful, and I really look forward to what's next to come. Their work has really underscored how these hubs create a concentration of illicit activities and actors, promoting transnational crime, terrorism, and financial crimes, as well as providing a safe haven for criminals, the corrupt, kleptocrats, terrorist financiers, and their money. I picture these hubs like a criminal nervous system circling the globe, with each hub a neuron of specialized cells that send signals, or in this case, goods, value, and services around the world. This system is essential to the well-being of criminal activity, and it could be argued that all of these hubs as a whole serve as a major determinant in the successful functioning of global illicit trade. And just as the nervous system is a center of thought, learning, and memory, so too do these hubs or neurons act as centers of learning and specialization. They allow actors to connect and specialize, as well as engender the convergence of different transnational crimes. As we've heard today, these hubs provide or act as a service, almost like a matchmaker, as I like to think, connecting traffickers with supply chain specialists. Those individuals responsible for transport are able to connect with multiple trades and goods. And in addition, all illicit actors can connect with gatekeepers who can help them hide and launder their activities and proceeds. In addition, this specialization and concentration also contribute to education. It suggests to me how these kind of prisons serving as quote unquote schools for criminals, allowing them to connect, to learn from each other, and improve their craft. Besides acting as a transit point, these hubs also boost illicit trade. In regards to counterfeiting, they provide a location for the conversion of counterfeit goods, transforming or combining legal items into a counterfeit one. Illicit whites and pharmaceuticals can be manufactured and diverted. Likewise, arms shipments can be diverted, and gold and other natural resources like wildlife and timber can be laundered. These hubs typically often share several similar features, as were noted, particularly by Dr. Shelley. They have permissive or enabling regulatory environments with weak oversight. They're a suitable transport and logistics infrastructure. They connect licit and illicit economies. They serve as an exit from or entry point to a larger market. Many of them have FTZs. And potentially, most importantly, corruption plays a large role in enabling or empowering the illicit activities. What is also not often noted is that these hubs often are a serious drain on domestic revenues, contributing to domestic revenue loss through smuggling, tax evasion, and misinvoicing, among other illicit activities. However, while these hubs share many similarities, there are some differences, such as the nature of the hubs. For example, some hubs arise during conflict, some are longstanding institutions, while others are dynamic and responding to market demands. Just as this, like the nervous system, the actors in these hubs detect changes in the environment and market and respond accordingly. And just like the nervous system, these hubs of illicit trade are a systemic problem. Combating them will have a systemic impact on illicit trade, not just on one crime or market or actor. As such, it will also take a systemic response. We have to work to degrade the nerve structure and strength, as well as block the signals between them, i.e. transport. Look to regulatory changes. This could potentially be one avenue, though I will admit this is challenging when the quote unquote host country or countries are willing to accept the bad, the crime, the illicit trade, etc., along with any good, which is largely financial. Can be greater engagement with the private sector, especially those sectors or businesses that are being exploited, as well as greater international cooperation. This project on the hubs of illicit trade will certainly serve as an accelerator to pinpoint both the challenges within these specific hubs, but also identify potential responses that will have a systemic, long-lasting impacts. Thank you very much.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Channing. I know your insight and the breadth of your insight will really help us in terms of focusing down some of our efforts. And next, I just want to turn to Dr. Joseph Lestrange. And Joseph has recently retired as the Division Chief of Homeland Security Investigations in a role which meant he provided executive oversight of the agency's strategic planning and operations and coordination for multiple law enforcement, intelligence, national security, and investigative units. And Joseph has been a part of initiatives, including, for example, tackling the trafficking and smuggling of humans, illegal firearms, fentanyl, opioids, narcotics, which I know is of interest to people in the chat because of the pharmaceutical trade, and a lot of other contraband. So Dr. Lestrange, if you wouldn't mind just giving us a couple of comments on your thoughts about how we focus our efforts in the most fruitful way. Thank you.
Thanks for that great introduction, Robin. And thank you to everybody, Dr. Shelley and Dave Luna, for inviting me to participate today in TRAC. We've been involved with each other for the last couple of years as a result of my duties with the government, and I'm excited to be a part of this conversation. So I have a couple of thoughts that I could provide a little bit of context, I think, to this conversation based on my 30 years in this field, countering transnational organized crime and working for an organization that enforces trade law as well as criminal law under the U.S. Customs laws of the United States, as well as having worked at different ports of entry, mostly in the United States, and also done casework globally. So there are a couple of interesting things that were said today. I think that I would like to sort of just provide a little context for. So these hubs that we've been talking about, I agree with all of the folks that presented today. They provide a vulnerability to our national security, as well as to prevent criminal networks from exploiting these systems. And one of the things that comes to mind is the FTZ aspect with respect to these free trade zones that are in many of these hubs. They were set up, they're a direct product of globalization. They were set up specifically to provide a neutral ground. I spent some time with FTZs, both up in New York as well as down on the border with Mexico and New Mexico when I was assigned there. And just to provide a little context, the whole idea behind the FTZs was to be able to provide a platform or a location where goods could come in as components primarily and be put together and then sent out where they're supposed to go as finished products. And of course, the rationale behind that type of a scenario, and there are other scenarios in FTZ, so I won't cover all of them, obviously, but that's one main, focus of an FTZ. And so, of course, the objective there is to not charge people duty in order to just bring parts or components into one area in order to build something that eventually becomes a finished product and goes out. Obviously, there are multiple vulnerabilities in having a process like that. By making things more open for trade and for commerce, you create vulnerabilities in that process. It's kind of, I think of it almost as like the internet, right? We created the internet to provide that instant communication all over the world and have multiple pathways in order to facilitate communication and publishing of information. And there are some vulnerabilities that come with that free open system. So, as somebody that spent a large part of my career in trying to enforce the law, I always like to say that it's kind of like hiding in plain sight, right? So, you have some unique problems that you have in these things. You have the what, right? What's the scheme? What are the products coming in and out, right? And then you have the who's involved in the scheme, right? And then, well, who has the authority to enforce the law, right? And then you have the how. How has the law actually even been broken, right? A lot of times that's the hard part. How are they breaking the law? Because of that unique environment that provides the ability to bring goods in, and obviously the criminal networks have, learned ways to exploit this by commingling legitimate goods with illegitimate goods, altering components that are supposed to be put into the cycle of production and bringing counterfeit, and substituting counterfeit for real components. So there's a lot of different ways that the schemes can work. And then, that becomes the big question there is how the criminal organization is exploiting the system, right? And have we even broken the law? Who ultimately is responsible for enforcing that law once that product is created and then it's moved out? Is it going to the country? Where, right? Is the product that is contaminated or commingled, is it going to where it's supposed to be going, or is it being diverted somewhere else, right? These are all the challenges that we face, in law enforcement, trying to enforce these types of environments. And there's also the timing, when a lot of times the law hinges upon being able to enforce certain aspects of customs law hinges upon when something arrived to these hubs, when it was put together and assembled and when it got out, right? So there are a lot of nuances sometimes to enforcing those laws. And then, ultimately why it's important, right? And I think the group here that spoke today obviously pointed out why this is very important for us to pay more attention to and stuff. So, I think those are some comments that I have on, the hubs. And I do agree that these are vulnerabilities and they are ripe for criminal activity, but they also serve a purpose in order to facilitate free trade, right? And to make it easier for people to have global operations and global commerce, build products, and save money and hopefully bring that cost savings to the customer. Although we're not seeing much of that right now with exactly. Inflation, right? So I just thought that would be something worth, discussing, and maybe later on, if we start talking about counter network a little bit, I might have a couple of more comments on that. But thank you very much for having me today, and I look forward to the continued discussion.
No, thank you. Thank you, Joseph. That's kind of a fascinating point to end on. Commodity prices being driven upwards create an absolute golden opportunity for illicit marketeers to plunge more effort into this. It forces this into a hugely economically attractive process, particularly in those commodities that are, 5 times the price they were recently. And I now want to turn to one of our Brazilian colleagues, and we're very lucky to have Bernardo Mota with us. Bernardo is an international specialist. He has 20 years of experience, particularly in anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. He's been a certified assessor in FATF evaluations, Financial Action Task Force, and he's advised many governments and the private sector and been a consultant for the IMF, the World Bank, UNODC, and many, many others. He's been a former chair of the Technical Assistance and Training Working Group of the Egmont Group, And he was the coordinator of the Working Group for Brazil's National Risk Assessment, created by presidential decree in 2020. And I will just ask him to just say a few words, because his experience in Brazil, but more broadly, is particularly relevant to us here as we try to capture both the illicit trade and also the financing of the illicit trade. So Bernardo, if you wouldn't mind just saying a few words to give us your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Robbie, and thank you to all to invite me to this kind of initiative. I think it's quite important to have this kind of approach in terms of looking at areas or hubs for illicit trade or illicit activities. And I think Brazil is a very complex country, considering that we have borders with 10 countries. And so we have 10 tri-border areas. So when I make a joke sometimes when people ask me about the tri-border area, and I say, which one of the 10 that we have? So I think it's important to bear this in mind, that we have several tri-border areas. And of course, considering the size, the length of the borders of Brazil, we have big problems here in terms of controlling activities, not only the illicit activities, but also try to combat the illicit activities. And I would make I would focus on the tri-border area of Brazil, Bolivia, and Paraguay, because I think Rashmi touched upon the tri-border area among Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina, and I will touch upon the area of Bolivia, Brazil, and Paraguay, which I think the main illicit activity in this area, of course, is the drug trafficking. It's a huge amount of drugs that is that are I would say trade or transported or trafficked between these areas, these borders. And I think it's very difficult to control. Just for people to understand the size of the border between Brazil and Bolivia, the size of the border between Brazil and Bolivia is longer than between US and Mexico, just for us to bear in mind how difficult it is to control this border between Brazil and Bolivia. And of course, the drug traffickers are aware of the situation, and the way they kind of put or trade their products, which we are talking about, which is drugs, is a little bit, I would say, it's interesting, because when we are talking about the traffic between the cities that are in the border, I am talking about Corumbá on the Brazilian side and Puerto Quijarro on the Bolivian side. The commerce of the drugs in the area is made by families, so it's very difficult to kind of identify and retain those drugs, because we are talking about a retail commerce of drugs in the area. But of course, they have, on the other hand, I would say the wholesale of drugs that are sent to big cities, especially Sao Paulo and Rio, because we have in Sao Paulo the PCC, Rashmi told about the PCC, the first capital command, and the CV, the red command in Rio. So we are talking about big amounts of big quantities of drugs that are sent to not only to Sao Paulo, but also to Rio. Of course, Brazil is a consumer of drugs, but Brazil is a kind of a transit of drugs that are sent to US and Europe. So we are talking about the most amount of money that are circulating in this area between Brazil and Bolivia is based on the drug trafficking. And then these drugs are the main, I would say, the main source of drugs that are sent to Europe and US. So in terms of intelligence to control this area, of course, we have the federal police and especially the customs in the area to control. But of course, we have to work under the intelligence perspective, which for us, it's important to take a look at the way of the operations or transactions are made in this area. Of course, try to get those families trade of drugs, but also the shell business that are established in the area, of course, and also to trade these drugs in the area, and of course and also to send the drugs in a big amount to the big city. So in terms of intelligence, we are trying to better understand the risks of the area. Of course, we are talking about drug trafficking, but also smuggling. Smuggling, I would say, is the second illicit activities of the area. and finally, I think it's important to bear in mind that the Bolivians are going to Brazil in a perspective of illicit human being trafficking. We can see in Sao Paulo, in the big cities, a lot of Bolivians working illegally as illegal immigrants there in these areas. Of course, based on the structure and based on the organized crimes to traffic those human beings to the big cities, of course, to explore those people in terms of working illegally in a very bad conditions. So I would stop here just for us to provoke some discussion, but basically this is what I would like to touch upon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bernardo. And that's a very relevant way of focusing our work on some of the illegal trade which causes the most harm, which is human trafficking and people smuggling. And we see this in so many different contexts in these different hubs of illicit trade, that it's important that we keep our focus on that humanitarian crisis. And finally, I just want to ask a colleague of mine at the Royal United Service Institute for Defence and Security Studies here in the UK to say a few words. Lauren Young is research analyst in organised crime and policing team at RUSI, and her research experience lies in organised environmental crime. And I've seen some questions we have about environmental crime in Africa as well, which sadly we're not covering in these particular hubs, but it's a huge global issue. Lauren has focused on wildlife trafficking, and she's conducted research in the UK, Eastern and Southern Africa, South America, and she leads RUSI's institute-wide climate change and security research program. And she has an MSc in conservation and wildlife trade from the University of Kent. And in a voluntary capacity, she helps to manage a conservation project in the Peruvian Amazon. So this is pretty close to her heart. Lauren, I'd love a couple of thoughts from you, please, just to finish us off in terms of illicit trade and how its context really needs to be focused upon in these particular hubs and these particular areas. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. That's great. Yeah, good morning, good afternoon to everyone around the world. And yeah, thank you very much for having me say a few thoughts on your presentations today. And thank you also for all the presentations. They were very, very interesting. Yeah, no, as Robin touched on there, my experience, whilst I work for RUSI on the organised crime and policing team, I do focus 100% of my time on environmental crime, but also have some experience working in the Peruvian Amazon for another number of years, working in wildlife conservation there on the ground. So I've seen sort of firsthand how some of the illegal wildlife trade and other environmental crimes like deforestation and things can have real sort of impacts on both the the biodiversity there, but also on sort of local livelihoods as well. So the the impacts are quite far-reaching. But one of the things I found really really exciting about the sort of hubs that you're studying in this project, I think, is that they are hubs that probably have been lesser studied from an aspect of environmental crimes before. So I think you're definitely going to will hopefully be addressing some of those sort of current knowledge gaps that we have in the environmental crime sort of academia as a whole. We tend to have been quite focused in the past on looking at those sort of focusing environmental crime around those kind of charismatic species. So you're talking the rhino, the elephant, the ivory, and I think these sort of hubs have a real possibility of addressing some of the other sort of species and other also natural resources that are being illicitly traded as well. So just moving beyond those charismatic species. But I think they also kind of really, I love the focus that it's going to be on that intersection with other serious crimes as well. I think that's something that we often, I think environmental crime often gets sort of forgotten. It is sort of seen as like well, certainly for the criminals that are involved in it, it's seen as quite a, it's a high profit, but a very low risk crime in comparison to the other serious crimes. But at the same time, a lot of actors who are facilitating drugs trafficking or human trafficking may well be facilitating sort of, environmental commodity trafficking as well. So I think these hubs have some really exciting prospects for, emphasizing the seriousness of environmental crime and those intersections as well. And I think, interestingly, the choice of certainly, I think, although my sort of passion lies much in sort of Latin America, but Dubai, I think, is a really key region for looking at wildlife laundering. They have certainly a high consumer market for exotic pets, and a lot of that comes from all around the world and is laundered through sort of legal trade channels. So I think Dubai would be a really interesting one to look at from that perspective as well. But also Ukraine as well, it is quite rich in natural resources, both in terms of the forests they have out there, so high risk of kind of deforestation that might be occurring under the conflict, but also it's quite rich in its sort of mining industries as well. So it will be very interesting, I think, with your project to monitor how that conflict, whether organized criminal groups under the conflict start utilizing those kind of natural resources to fund their activities and things, and the conflict as well. So that's quite an exciting prospect from my point of view. But yeah, I'm very excited to see how it develops, and I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Lauren. That's really helpful, and it's nice to get that perspective, particularly with the environmental angle layered onto these. Often there are trades here that make more money, potentially because of their scale, but environmental trades do so much harm to an environment, to a community, to an overall economy. And when we're talking about environmental harm, which removes species from the planet, that's an unquantifiable impact that we need to take real care of as we look at these particular hubs, whether that be an environmental focus or another illicit trade. So thank you all. Those are really helpful comments. They help us kind of both focus the work on the hubs, but they also help elevate our attention to how this is happening and why they're happening in those particular areas where governance is perceived and the rule of law is perceived to be often weaker. I'm going to turn back over now to Judy just to outline next steps. I don't know, Judy, if we're going to be taking questions or not, so I'm going to leave it to Judy and leave you in her safe hands from now on. But thank you to all our contributors so far. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Robin, and thank you, everyone. All the speakers have been great, and all the discussants, and we've also really appreciated the audience. This is one of the rare audiences that we have where not only have there been a lot of great questions in the chat, but the vast majority of the audience has stuck through to the end of the presentations, which speaks to the quality of the presentations, of course. I just wanted to say a few words, and then maybe we can have a little discussion afterwards. But one thing I wanted to mention is to make it clear that this presentation is the launch of a project, right? It's not the results of the project. So we're still really looking forward to the fact that we'll be doing real research on all of these hubs. There has been a lot of discussion in the chat about the hubs that we haven't hit, about hubs in Africa, and of course we're not doing any hubs in Asia. Now, Louise mentioned some of the considerations that went into the selection of these hubs, but I do want to emphasize that, we really see this project as the beginning of a process. So we're certainly not saying that these are the only important hubs. We're hopeful that, as this discussion kind of gathers strength, that we may be able to continue beyond these 4 hubs, and we'd be really interested in working on other hubs. And the same thing goes for the trades that we will be discussing. I think even from the preliminary research, it's been pretty clear to us that each of these hubs has a lot of stories to tell, and we're not going to be able to tell all the stories in each of these hubs. What we are going to be trying to do is, as Louise said, kind of emphasize the interconnections between the hubs and how these interconnections between the hubs, their impact, their worldwide impact, and the sort of convergence of the trades. So one of the reasons why we're happy about doing this is that we have picked hubs other than Dubai. These are hubs that aren't that well researched. So that's also an important part of it. We also appreciate the fact that we are a global team, that we've really learned under COVID how to work as a global team. And I think you've heard from our, some of our global partners, but we really look forward to expanding that part. And then, as Louise said, this is really an opportunity to do the empirical work first, and then see where it leads us, and then come up with recommendations. And we find often that when we are doing research, that we sort of do it the other way around. We start coming up with the research, with the recommendations, and then we have to find the evidence behind it. So this is really going to be in the other direction, and we're very open to what we're going to find and what kind of recommendations we're going to be making. And then the final thing I just wanted to mention is that we would like to include as many of you as possible in this effort. So we will be, we have on the TRAC website, we have a page devoted to this project. If you go to it now, I think you will see a fact sheet that has sort of the basics about each of these 4 hubs from today's presentations, and also a description of the project as a whole. And we would very much encourage those of you who are interested to join our mailing list. We'll keep it updated, and we will inform people of our future events. We plan to have a webinar probably every couple of months, and we haven't decided exactly on the topics in advance. We're going to see where the research takes us. So depending on what our findings of most interest are, we will organize a webinar around that. And again, we will invite some of you, as many of you as possible, to join us for that webinar, and also to join us in the discussions. I wish that we had more time to take questions. We do still have 8 minutes though. So I'm wondering if anybody on our panel would like to answer some of the questions that were in the, or any of the questions that were raised by the, in the chat. Louise, maybe about pharmaceuticals, or Rashmi, I think you had something to say on the on pharmaceuticals in Latin America.
Absolutely, but I will defer to Louise if she would like to start.
I would say that under another project that we're doing at TRAC, which is funded by the NSF on illicit supply chains, we've been working in cooperation with 3M for about 16 months now. And one of the major entry points for counterfeit PPE into the United States is through Peru. So I've seen, I've taken notes of who in the audience is working on illicit trade in pharmaceuticals and medical devices. But our research has not shown anything that has transited either anywhere in Central America or anywhere in the tri-border related to counterfeit PPE. There's just been one major route, which tells us one thing, that not everything is going through these trade hubs, or 2, we may be missing it through our methods and our ways of reporting it. And so this is why we've had this launch, and thank goodness over 160 of you showed up, and we have people to talk to and follow up with on these issues. But I think it's important to understand what also, that much illicit trade goes through other regions that are not just the trade hubs we're looking at. And we chose, as we said, under-researched ones, but there are certainly other key locales that need to be looked at.
I would add to that. Thank you, Judy. So one of the things that we know, one of the questions that was asked was very, very linked to Latin American pharmaceuticals, counterfeits linked to pharmaceuticals. And here we know in general, there was I think it was 2017 or 2018 academic study where Brazil was actually placed number 3 worldwide, with India and China leading in terms of poor quality drugs that were being made. And out of the poor quality drugs, or the drugs that were failing testing, it was something in the range of 35–36% of these drugs that were actually labeled as made in Brazil. Now, we know for that reason, and we know on the basis of what Louise just said, that, Brazil has been a supplier of counterfeit medication and masks, also linked to the COVID-19 crisis. But in addition to all of this, we know The law enforcement in Brazil, the standards for drugs in Brazil are very high. So one of the things that's very interesting about these figures is that a lot of the drugs that are marked as being made in Brazil are not always made in Brazil. So for instance, when we link, we don't have information on counterfeits and COVID-19 PPE masks linked to Brazil or the TBA right now as the hub. But we do know, for instance, that there are counterfeit pharmaceuticals that are actually produced in Paraguay, in Ciudad del Este, so the tri-border area on the side of Paraguay, which is a key transit point for the counterfeit products in South America as a whole. But a lot of the material that is actually produced in Paraguay is passed off as Brazilian made, and actually, routed through the Paraguayan side of the TBA. And the reason for that is because Brazilian drug standards are higher. So they get further in the market if they label it as made in Brazil. So what's actually interesting for us is that even the figures that we have from these established studies that list percentages of how much counterfeit is made are problematic figures, because when you really start diving deep into the figures, made in Brazil is not necessarily made in Brazil. So 35% of labeled made in Brazil, how much of that is actually made elsewhere? And those are the kind of gaps that we are trying to figure out and find. But I mean, this is what we know about pharma and counterfeits in Brazil and Latin America. So absolutely relevant, and hopefully something that we can touch on and discover more about.
Thank you, Rashmi. Just one last question that somebody raised, which I think is interesting, and maybe somebody on the panel would like to answer it, is ask whether there are examples of hubs of illicit trade that have turned around and become hubs of legal trade. And I think that's an interesting question for us to look into. Does anybody have any thoughts?
Let me jump
Joe?
in. Yeah, let Joe go, and then I'll chime in after Joe.
And then we will let you all go. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, I think, from my experience at least, we have to keep perspective that there's legitimate commerce going on in these places as well, and that they were set up to facilitate that. And of course, criminal organizations are going to exploit that. So I think, the more we do to try and close some of the loopholes with regulations and processes to identify, criminal activity, the more we tilt the needle towards the more legitimate trade versus illegitimate trade. Now obviously in a place, a particular hub where it's kind of anarchy because nobody's really paying attention, the authorities aren't paying attention, we're going to be tilting the needle over in the other direction. But one of the things, like for example, what I found challenging when I was down on the border with Mexico was that we would have hosts. They were building an FTZ across the border, and then we had sort of co-responsibility for managing the product that came out of that FTZ, right? But at the same time, you're in Mexico, whereas we have more control over the FTZs that are within the United States, right? So we would have to then work with Mexican authorities, who, as we all know, sometimes have some influence, we'll call it to be nice, influenced by the cartels and the criminal organizations, right? Especially within the customs arena. So, it becomes challenging where, the goals and the objectives of what's considered operating a facility, and the goals and objectives of how important, identifying and combating criminal activity can be different depending upon where we go. Because at the end of the day, right, these things are all set up to facilitate the exchange of product, money, transfer of value, right? And, law enforcement efforts in some parts of the world especially are looked at as just sort of obscure things that go on while we're trying to make money, whereas, in other parts of the world, it's taken more seriously. And at the end of the day, even companies that are working in these areas, sometimes they just understand that the price of doing business is to turn away and not really pay attention to some of the criminal activities that go on, right? So I think that we can work towards identifying where the gaps and vulnerabilities are. I think the time is well served doing that, and then trying to influence, the lawmakers or the regulators or even the associations that govern some of or work in some of these facilities and stuff, to encourage them and incentivize them to take measures in order to reduce the illicit trade that happens in these facilities. But whether we'll ever get rid of it completely, absolutely not. I just think, by one of the, downstream effects or unintended consequences of opening up a free trade zone, or to, take regulations away in order to facilitate trade and commerce, you're going to have these vulnerabilities. And so I think we can mitigate them, but I don't think we could ever get rid of them completely. I hope that kind of answers the question a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Look, I think in all of these hubs, we will be looking at the illicit dynamics, because in the world of globalized trade, obviously a lot of legal commerce is taking place in the 4 hubs. I just wanted to underscore, as Casey did in the chat, if you are interested in continuing following our project, please do email us at track@gmu.edu. So with that, I think, Judy, we're at the end here.
All right. Well, thank you all very much again. And we look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you very much.